You're listening to Data Science Leaders, the premier podcast for executives tackling the world's most important challenges using the power of machine learning. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome. Today's episode is a collaboration with the Ethical Machines podcast. It features Reed Blackman, CEO of the AI ethical risk consultancy Virtue, and Nick Elprin, co-founder CEO of Domino Data Lab. They discuss the differences between AI ethics and AI governance, how the discussion and challenges have changed and sometimes stay the same, the people, process, and technology solutions for genAI governance, and how they are actually all aligned, as well as their predictions about AI maturity, slip-ups, and regulation. Oh my. Please enjoy.
So Nick, what I find interesting, both of us have been talking about AI governance for a while now, not just talking about it, but actually doing it. We've been both working with different kinds of organizations on how to do AI governance. And you come from a technology perspective. I come from, a philosophy perspective, an ethics perspective, a risk and compliance perspective at this point, maybe, arguably. Anyway, I wanted to talk with you about how we should think what AI governance is. I find it frustrating how many terms get thrown around in this space. There's AI governance, there's AI ethics, there's responsible AI, there's trustworthy AI, there's AI risk management. There's probably others that I'm not thinking about at the moment. Oh, there's alignment. People talk about alignment a lot. Trust and safety. I don't know. There's all these terms that go flying around. It drives me nuts as a philosopher who likes to keep his concepts ordered. This is not an ordered space. Why don't we start with how you think about what AI governance amounts to? Or what do you think of when you think of AI governance? And do you distinguish it from these other kinds of phrases that I've also tossed around?
Yeah, it's a great question. As a preface, I'll just acknowledge I don't have the misgivings that you may have as a philosopher. I'm quite comfortable with these all being loose terms. And I think coming from a more commercial orientation and running a business is working with customers, trying to deal with this stuff, I tend to focus more on what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and I don't really care what you call it.
Yeah, sure.
So from that sense, through that lens, I'll give my personal view, which I don't posit as something to be authoritative and something to be a formal forever definition, but just how I think about it.
This is going in the books. It's going in the books.
Yeah, well, and then it'll be wrong in 3 months. But from my perspective, AI governance is pretty simply like how you want to ensure that your models or AI systems are complying with your policies, whether those are internal policies or whether those are external regulations, and how you are ensuring they are doing what you expect they'll do. That begs the question to an extent, because what are your policies? I think you could have policies, depending on the kind of organization you are, you could have policies that are more about complying with legal frameworks. You could also have policies that are more about what I would call ethical AI, is more like, do we understand the implications of these AI systems on the rest of the world, and how do we tally the balance sheet of positive and negative impacts and things like that. But I think it's the prerogative of a different organization to decide how much they want to weigh those different things.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's where I start. I'm curious how you see it. You've thought about the ontology and the taxonomy here a lot more than I have.
I know I've thought about it. Whether I thought about it more than you, I don't know. Maybe. Anyway, so here's one place where I think that we get some, I don't know if it's ambiguity or something else, but when you think about AI governance, it sounds like you think about it in terms of governing the model. And so what we need to do is we need to get our hands around the model. And I guess I think of it, AI governance that is, as broader than that. Because I think it has to also encompass, and maybe you think the same, this is why it's a semantic issue, not a real disagreement. But it's something like, how do we as an organization, how do we build all the stuff, which is going to be technology, there's going to be tools, but it's also risk assessments for particular models, but it's also going to be things like, yes, what's the policy? It's going to be things like, how do we educate and train our people? I think it's part and parcel of AI governance. How do we train people? Who needs to be trained? What kind of training do they need? Who's responsible for what? I think of things like AI ethical or AI risk committees. I think of things like a charter for that committee, so they actually have a jurisdiction. I think about some member of the C-suite owning the program. And so I guess I think of AI governance less as about our models and more about how we treat our models.
I don't think I disagree with that. And at the risk of sounding defensive, I think my definition was so broad that it can encompass what you were describing.
Yeah.
My definition is, do you as an organization get comfortable that your models are complying with your policies? If your policy is, we have to have a risk committee that reviews the use case and anything before a model goes into production, so be it. Yeah. That's something you need to implement as part of your process. I think you make a good point about training the workforce, though. I think that's something that doesn't fit so nicely into my definition. And I think that's a really good point. And yeah, as part of a holistic sort of risk management and talent program, I do think that's important.
I always thought, insofar as I've been thinking about these things, I've thought training is important, but it strikes me that it's more important now than it used to be because of generative AI. Because it used to be, all right, look, there's ways this thing can go sideways. There's the people who make the model or the solution, the AI-driven solution, whatever you want to call it. And then there's the people who use it. And you got to train those people.
Yep.
And now it feels, okay, you've got the foundation model people, right? You've got the people at OpenAI or Microsoft or Google or Anthropic, whatever it is. And then you've got downstream developers. So first of all, things can go sideways because the foundation model builders can do things in a not great way. Then you've got things that can go sideways because they sell to a Fortune 500 company. Those developers are tweaking it in all sorts of ways, RAG and whatnot. And so things can go sideways if they don't deal with their things properly. And then, of course, the set of end users, especially as this stuff scales, is much broader to the point of being almost every employee in the company, anyone who has access to Copilot for those companies who deploy that. And then things go sideways if they prompt, let's say, an LLM wrong. And so that's why I now think one of the underappreciated aspects of making sure your models don't go sideways is make sure your people don't use it in stupid ways, which requires training.
I agree. And yeah, I think my thinking back at my response a couple minutes ago, like I'm very clearly coming from the perspective of, I'm answering the question from the perspective of companies that are, organizations that are building their own models and AI systems.
Yeah.
Because that's what we help our customers do.
Yeah.
But you're right. You're totally right that there's this whole other set of ways that people around an organization are using productized AI. And that has a whole other set of implications. If you're just using ChatGPT, a company is not necessarily thinking about, like, they're not the ones who built ChatGPT. They didn't build the underlying model or whatever. So they're not necessarily thinking about governing that model, but they are exposing themselves to risks and thinking about how does a company have to educate their workforce and put guardrails in place around how those systems get used. Yeah. So if I were going to amend my answer, maybe I would say it's ensuring that the models and the usage of AI systems adheres to your policies, whether those are internal policies or external regulations. As an example, thinking about like the EU AI Act, and I suppose it would be obvious, it'd be obviously problematic if a company built a resume screener model or a hiring decision interview assessor model. But look, a recruiter could upload a resume to ChatGPT just as easily and say, should we put this candidate forward in our process and still be exposed to risks?
Yeah. This transition to generative AI is interesting. And I guess I want to hear your thoughts on what did AI governance, from your perspective, look like before generative AI, before the explosion of ChatGPT, et cetera? Yeah, what did it look like before? And how is that different from what it looks like now?
Yeah, I'll answer that. And then I think we should also talk a bit more about like other changes in the last few years. Because I think generative AI was not the only thing that changed. But I divide the world into two groups on this question. There's AI or traditional predictive machine learning in the context of regulated industries. And then there's non-regulated organizations. I think the short answer is like the non-regulated organizations weren't really thinking about it at all. And now they're thinking about it. And I think the regulated industries, like finance, insurance.
Yeah, you're thinking about things like using AI to make mortgage predictions or using just any kind of algorithm to make.
Yeah.
Are they going to default on a mortgage?
Yeah.
Are they going to pay back the loan? Are they going to, et cetera, et cetera? What should their credit limit be?
Yeah, and I think they've had to deal with these questions for a long time. For decades, because they've always been subject to legal frameworks and sort of formal policies that govern how models get used. I was talking to someone who's running a responsible AI group for one of the country's biggest banks. And I asked her this question, and her answer was like, look, from my perspective, not that much has changed because we've always had to put our models through pretty rigorous processes and controls to understand what they're doing.
Like there are regulations around having to provide explanations for why someone got denied a mortgage. And so when people talk about, there's AI around, we've got deep neural networks, we need explainability. The banks are like, yeah, we've been doing explainability for a long time, or we've been making sure that the models are already sufficiently transparent such that we can explain why we denied or approved a mortgage or a loan application, et cetera.
Right. And so what's changed is that the underlying methods have expanded and become more complicated.
Yeah, sure.
And I think to your point earlier, something else has changed is now the surface area for use cases has expanded much more widely, right? If you're a relationship manager and you're using like an LLM assistant to help guide your responses to a customer, now all of a sudden you've opened up a surface area for a bunch of things that could put you out of compliance with what you say.
Yeah.
Whereas before that wasn't as much of a risk because, like you said, the use cases are more surgical, more targeted. It's, are we going to approve this loan or something? Yeah, a wider range of use cases, more complex and diverse underlying methods and technologies in the algorithms themselves. But at the end of the day, I think the regulated industries have been thinking about this and dealing with it for a long time. I think one other thing I'll say, I don't know how provocative you like to be on this podcast. Do you like to keep it pretty mainstream, or do you like to get a little peppery?
Spice it up.
One thing I'll throw out there, and I'm curious if you're seeing the same thing. I don't think this is related to genAI, but just another change I've noticed in the last 3 to 5 years. You rewind the clock, a lot of the discussion around AI governance, responsible AI, ethical AI was really about what I would call like broad societal impact questions.
Mhm.
Is this perpetuating certain like power structure imbalances in society? What are the implications on climate change and like carbon footprint? And I don't hear as much of that anymore. Like I hear much more. What is the business risk that these models are creating for us? How are we managing that business risk? What's the risk of negative customer experiences? What's the risk of profitability, revenue loss? And what's the risk of legal compliance? And in some ways, it kind of mirrors what I think is another trend we saw in like the workplace overall, with sort of an underemphasis or a fading to the background of like DE&I discussions that came along with ratcheting up of more budget pressures and more cost consciousness. And I think my hypothesis is that for a lot of organizations, some of these discussions about broader societal impacts were nice to have and important, but not as urgent. And so they've fallen a little bit out of prioritization.
I don't know that I agree with that. I see where you're coming from. I'm inclined to think something like this. I think the volume at which, I'm just going to call them like the activist type people who are talking about climate change and positive social impact and blah, blah. I think that the volume at which they speak has been more or less the same. And I think the volume at which the business risk people speak has been turned up since generative AI. I think that they were talking about it. Whenever I worked with clients prior to generative AI, it was never because, or at least not the primary reason, not the reason for which budget was spent. Oh, we want to do good in the world and hold hands and sing hallelujah. It was always, we're using AI in a variety of ways and we don't want things to go sideways reputationally, for our brand, regulatorily. People, of course, were already turned on to biased or discriminatory AI. Let's say lending case, right? You don't want to discriminate against, say, Black people when lending money. So I think the business risk stuff was always there. I just think they're now talking a lot louder because now AI has exploded in popularity in the general public. It's also exploded in popularity within businesses. And now the CEO is talking about AI in a way the CEO was not talking about AI pre-ChatGPT. And so I think like you're right. I agree with you in the sort of the data, so to speak, that the business risk talk is a lot louder. But I don't think it's because the other stuff is gone. I just think it's getting a bit more drowned out by the louder business risk talk.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I think the other thing that's interesting, it's a change that's somewhat recent, and I think it'll continue. So I think it's like the beginning of a trend. I think a lot of the discussion of AI governance several years ago was very what I call algorithm centric. So it was a lot about how do we interrogate an algorithm we're using? Like you were saying earlier, do we have explainability? Can we introspect what it's doing? Can we explain why it made a certain decision? But like the lens around it was very much, there's this algorithm we are scrutinizing.
Right. And then you get the language of auditing. I think the language of
important.
algorithm auditing has, I could be wrong about this. My sense is that the phrase algorithmic auditing, that phrase is used a lot less now.
I don't hear that. Yeah, I don't hear it often.
Yeah.
So that's still important. And there's a role to play, that has a role to play for sure in an overall kind of comprehensive governance process and framework. But I think that the shift I'm seeing is that instead of being more algorithm centric, companies are taking a more process centric view of what governance means, which is to say, we're not just interrogating the final algorithm at the end of the day. We're looking at how was that built, going all the way back to what's the use case that it's for and who has reviewed that use case and what's the risk level of that use case.
Yeah.
And then like what data was used to create it and who signed off on that data. And so it's more this thing that spans across a pretty long journey and has tendrils out to a whole bunch of other ingredients, as opposed to being so focused on just this final algorithm bit.
Yeah. And do you have a hypothesis as to why the conversation has become that? I've got one. I just think that they're getting savvier. I think it's always been a people process technology thing. It's always been, what's the use case? What's the training data? What kind of testing did it go through? Why did you come up with those benchmarks? What justifies those benchmarks? What's the risk threshold? Blah, blah, blah. I think that's always been the thing. And now I just think that people are more educated than they used to be. And here's one, maybe this is quasi-anecdotal, but everyone knows that OpenAI, when they trained GPT, whatever, 3.5 and now 4.0, and who knows, whatever before that, and all the other variations, that they scraped the internet. They used every book and magazine and YouTube transcript and anything they could find. And so everyone and their mother got really worked up about IP concerns or privacy violations or copyright law. And that's still in the courts now. Obviously, people are very much worked up about it. And so that question, and people went bananas over this. The artists went crazy over losing their work. Authors all up in arms. And so I think
New York Times still trying to sue. Yeah.
Yeah, they're suing right now. So I think like that public outrage led to people asking questions like, wait, where's the training data from? Wait, what are you using it for? And then, of course, if it's in the public consciousness, it's going to seep into the business consciousness. And so I think we've just had bigger issues that have made people realize, oh, it's not just a sort of algorithm problem. It's a bigger set of issues. And so I think that's what sort of has led to the appropriate zooming out by the people who are actually addressing it in companies.
That resonates with me. I agree with that hypothesis. I'll throw out another one too, which I think is certainly not mutually exclusive.
Totally.
But I think the other thing that's happening is as the modeling techniques have gotten more sophisticated, and by the way, like genAI drives this to an extreme, but this was happening even before genAI with just more complex deep learning, multi-layer neural networks and things like that. In a lot of these cases, the model actually can't really be understood. You can't give an explainability analysis. Or if you're talking about things like a natural language model or an image classification model, natural language is a better example. Or if you're doing a summarization model or something like that, there may not be a black and white correct answer.
Yeah.
Or there's not a precise explainability output it is possible to produce. And so in a case where it's not like software development where you can write a unit test and say, did this thing pass or fail, binary, black and white, yes or no? In those cases, the only way you can have confidence in what a model is doing is to have some sort of process where you're asking questions like, who has reviewed what test cases? Who has reviewed what sample inputs and outputs? Has there been a red teaming? Has anyone red teamed it? You know what I'm saying? The validation is not binary testable. The validation has to be some review process.
When I think about AI regulations, I've often said, look, there's two kinds of regulations. There's the ones that want you to produce a certain result. Okay, listen, for cars, it's got to be 50 miles per gallon by 2030, whatever it is. I don't care how you get there. Just make it the case that this car is going to go 50 miles per gallon by this time. And so it's a results-oriented regulation. And as opposed to a process that you have to require. So you can't say for AI, these are the results that we want. Because there's a billion different kinds of results, because there's a billion kind of use cases, because it's general purpose technology. It can be used in countless contexts. And so there can't be regulations unless they're just prohibiting, you can't do X. You can't use facial recognition software in the general public, blah, blah, blah. It's got to be process oriented. And this is just me echoing. I agree with you that we have to have requirements around procedures, process. And I think that this is the case with the criminal justice system as well. It is the case that there's an answer, right? Either they're innocent or they're not, right? Either they did it or they didn't. The butler killed him or he did not. But we don't have, if you like, direct access to that truth. What we have is a set of procedures that we think are most likely going to result in getting the right judgment. I like your example of the summarization, using AI to summarize. There's not actually it's less binary than he did it, he didn't do it. But also it's something like the best that we can do is introduce a bunch of processes that we think are going to result in, this thing can be relied upon for summarization.
And there will be regulatory frameworks like the executive order or the EUA Act or whatever. But every company is going to have their own tailored need for a tailored policy based on their business domain. So a summarization in one context is going to have to go through a different set of checks and what does it mean to have a process that gives us confidence we'll have a good summarization model? That's going to be very different for a pharmaceutical company that's summarizing research versus a financial service advisor that's summarizing market research. It's going to have to be tailored. But like you said, I think I really like this distinction of like process oriented versus outcome oriented mandate, and makes sense. Just tying it all the way back and really driving the point home, I think. several years ago, a lot of the discussion, not all of it, but a lot of the discussion I heard about AI governance was I'd put in the outcome oriented space. Is your model explainable? Yeah. Whereas now I think that's really shifting and it's much more, did it adhere to a process that we've defined as giving our organization confidence?
Yeah, that sounds right. And so, wait, before we lose the thread completely, why did we, that is to say, you raised the distinction between the companies that were heavily regulated already, like financial services, versus the unregulated ones,
Oh,
and how that plays a role in the
oh,
evolution of AI governance?
I was making this point that for regulated companies, not that much has changed, except the
I see.
techniques have gotten more complicated and so the processes need to evolve. But I think for non-regulated companies, I think there's a much bigger, a discrete step change that's happening,
Yeah.
which is they haven't really thought about governance
Yeah.
because they haven't really, the use cases they've had for AI have not been as risky and there's been no regulatory overlay.
Mm.
And so it hasn't mattered. And now it's starting to matter. And that's forcing these companies to have to develop whole new, like you were saying, like
Whole new
governance
governance.
boards
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
think through building policy, building all this organizational
Yeah.
infrastructure
Yeah. Yeah.
to do a thing for the very first time. So it's a much bigger change and shift.
Yeah, I've seen that. So this is why my sort of at the time ignorance of these kinds of considerations is what made me think this was early on. This was like when I was leaving academia and I was starting this consultancy that healthcare was going to lead the charge with AI ethics outside of big tech. I thought, okay, they speak the language of ethics. They have AI ethics. Sorry, they have ethics committees. They have IRBs that you got to pass in order to do research on human subjects. So those are like
Yep.
quasi ethics committees. There's a deep literature on biomedical ethics. Everyone's familiar with medical debates and issues around, say, CRISPR before AI was really on the scene and people getting worked up about CRISPR. And I was totally wrong. They've been the slowest, one of the slowest. And it's not low risk, as you mentioned, it's high risk, but like, they don't already speak the language of model risk governance. And financial services, I thought was going to be
Right,
last.
right.
And they've been, I don't want to say leading the way, but they've been ahead of most other kinds of industries because they've been speaking the language of model risk governance for years. And so, to my surprise, years ago, financial services was way ahead in overseeing AI, at least for non-generative AI. I actually don't know about the generative AI case. That actually just occurs to me that I don't know how financial services compares to others because it's not quite the same kind of model governance. Healthcare, I think, is caught on their heels because they don't have model risk governance. That's not the language they speak. They don't have the internal, as you said, the infrastructure to do it. And it means that they can't do the things they want to do with AI, right? Because they can. I thought we would see a tremendous amount of innovation in healthcare, and we have not, I don't think. And the reason we haven't really seen it is because you can't put any of it into practice. You can't put any of it into practice because the healthcare systems just don't have that governance infrastructure.
Yeah. And not being able to do what they want to do, I think, is a really important point. And I've seen this as well. I don't have a healthcare example, but I think a telling example was a consumer packaged goods company I talked to last year. And they were essentially so paralyzed that they were just sitting on the sidelines. And they had ideas for how they wanted to use some of this Gen AI stuff. And it's like compelling business case. But they were sort of like, we view it all as too risky. We don't want to do anything until we better understand what could go
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah,
And so I think the companies that have not already had organizational infrastructure and organizational maturity around how to do model governance, model management, they are at risk of losing out on the business opportunity for them unless they can pretty quickly bootstrap some of that infrastructure.
yeah. I totally think that's true. I find myself uneasy saying such things because it feels salesy to me. It's sort of like it enables
Yeah.
innovation. And since I'm in the business,
Right.
and so are you, of helping companies manage these risks, it feels salesy, but it's also true. It's just true.
Yeah.
I've also run into a lot of the work that we do now, frankly, is helping them to understand how do we even monitor this stuff, right? They want to deploy, they deploy like in these little pockets, but they won't do it at scale because they don't know how to track it. And figuring out how to do that, until they figure out how to do that, they won't do it. It's too risky. Like, what executive wants to give the green light to deploy it at scale, and then things go sideways because they have no idea how to monitor it, and then they're on the line.
Right. Yeah. And a couple of anecdotes about that. Like this, the reason I don't feel as salesy about it, as you mentioned, is because I think there's enough of a track record of like real valuable use cases now. And the CPG company I was referring to, like they had a great use case for generating marketing content.
Yep.
So that's a bunch of leverage and efficiency gains. It's not like a generating new revenue, but that's significant efficiency gains for an internal workforce. But they were like deathly afraid of potential copyright violations.
Mm.
But in contrast, like there was a very large global financial services company, bank that I was talking to recently, and what they described is they've got a policy that they enforce that is no GenAI use case currently can be done without a human in the loop to review output. So it can't be automatically going to customer, output can't be automatically going to customers. And so I think they were able to come up with a very good cut through way of mitigating that risk. Whereas I think the organizations that like haven't been steeped in thinking about risk and these sorts of things for decades, they're like struggling to even know where to start.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's true. There's sufficient evidence for it to be that it's not a sales pitch. It's not like a bullshit. At least we're not saying things like, you'll innovate 10 times faster. It's not that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. 25% efficiency gain for a team of creative professionals. That's a big deal.
Yeah. No, I saw recently also CPG, they showed me a commercial that they made using AI, and it was pretty awesome. And they didn't do it until they had the right kinds of ways of tracking the thing and overseeing the thing and being able to create the right kinds of interventions. And of course, putting the right kinds of guardrails around it so that people interacting with it wouldn't say crazy things that would be bad for the brand. But also because it was one of their first large scale deployments, they didn't go as big with it as they could have. They didn't promote it as much as they could have because they're just getting their feet wet with, all right, we're going to release this AI into the wild, so to speak. We think we know how to measure it. We think we know how to track it. There's humans in the loop, obviously, but it's still a test run for us, frankly. And so they're still not, even though it was successful, they're still not marching it across the globe, so to speak, because they don't totally have the systems in place.
Yeah.
One question I have for you is around what it looks like to have a kind of technological solution around generative AI in particular. So I'm not a technologist. Whenever we work with clients, we're not introducing new technology into their systems. We're doing the things like, policy procedures, metrics for measuring the rollout, compliance, and impact of their program, writing training scripts, training people, blah, 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 strategic roadmap, that sort of thing. But what we don't do is we don't say, and here's the tech software that you have to use. Now, I know what the tech software looks like for non-generative AI. I at least I get it conceptually right off the bat. Okay, so you've got some loan, or let's say distributing goods across various people. So maybe it's an interview for a job. Maybe it's admission to a college. You ask a question like, hey, are we distributing this good across the various subpopulations in a fair way? And then you wheel in your tech software. It gives you a kind of mathematical analysis of the different kinds of distributions, and you choose which is the appropriate way of measuring fairness in this particular case. But it's looking at how quantitatively, how are you distributing these goods and services across these various subpopulations. So I get what a tech solution, or at least I get the kind of contribution that technology solution has to make, because otherwise, I don't know, how many Black women did we give loans to? I don't know. Like, you got to wheel in the tech. And then how does that compare quantitatively to white men? Again, you're going to need some tech solution for that. I get how explainability has a tech solution. Like, we want to try to approximate how the model is coming out with its outputs. And so you have things like Lyman Sharp to tell you that sort of thing. So I get those. I guess I don't have as great a grip as I would like on what it looks like, what kind of tech solution looks like for a generative AI solution.
Yeah.
I get you're going to red team it. So you're going to have a bunch of people try to beat this thing up and make it say inappropriate things or make it go sideways. And but that's not a tech solution so much as that just strikes me as a pretty manual solution. So what does the tech solution look like for generative AI? Or not solution, but a part of the overall solution at a minimum, a tech tool.
No, I get it. It's a great question. First, I'll answer in two parts. And the first part is I do slightly disagree with your characterization of the red teaming thing as an example of a manual solution, not a tech solution, by which I mean there is a huge opportunity for technology to help with the enforcement and streamlining of the process you want your model development to go through to be compliant with your policies.
Totally fair.
And I will say, to a lot of customers trying to implement governance, a huge pain point for them is it is too manual. It's model review validation teams keeping lists of things in Excel, in SharePoint, and homegrown tools they built. Makes it hard for them to collaborate with the modelers and the data scientists. Yeah. They have a question 6 months after the model got developed. They can't go back and find what data was used to build the original model. So the streamlining of that process is a huge problem that is ripe for technical innovation.
Totally agree with you there. Yeah.
Okay. But to your point, I know what you mean. The algorithmic part of understanding what is an LLM doing, what is a GenAI system doing, and how do we know it's what we expect. There are a couple aspects of that. The first is putting in place what some people call guardrails or some people call evaluations around a genAI system or an LLM, which is to say, you might have a series of checks you want to perform on the input or the output of an LLM.
Mm-hmm.
So you might want to run a screen on an output to say, was there toxic or abusive language in this response? People are now using LLMs to check each other's output, right? To say, do you think this response was a hallucination? And so check it.
Yeah.
And then it's the fox guarding the hen house or whatever. But it works pretty well.
Yeah, no, there are ways in which LLMs can actually do a good job critiquing each other's output.
Yeah. LLM is a judge, right? And these are getting better and the techniques are getting more refined. You can also do that on the input, right? Before this goes to our chatbot, let's review the input and make sure it doesn't have any PII. Right? And so you put rails around the input or the outputs, and you put sort of evaluations around the output to say, depending on what we think is responsible, is safe for this particular use case, are we having certain checks that get tripped or violated? And then you can monitor the rate of that over time. So you can say, over time, is the number of sort of hallucinations or toxic responses trending up? Did it spike up? That can tell you, like, hey, something's changed with the underlying model or the way it's getting used. The other thing you can do, though, there's sort of two other things you can do. And by the way, a variation of that is you can run a bunch of those evaluation checks as a benchmark on a recurring basis against a commercial or underlying foundation model. You can run a bunch of your benchmark checks against ChatGPT and make sure that it's not changing over time in how it's responding to those evaluations.
Sorry, can you give me an example of that one?
Oh, yeah. The concern is, like, if you're using ChatGPT 4.0 or something, like, is it changing over time in how it's responding to certain prompts? You can set up a whole bunch of benchmark prompts and you can evaluate the quality of each response against your benchmark.
So it could be something like, let's say you're using a ChatGPT 4.0, and you're using it to generate marketing copyright. And based on certain kinds of, you give it certain kinds of prompts, like, hey, here's our product, here are its features. Can you write it in the style of our brand? And it kicks out blah, blah, blah. And you have a way of figuring out, you have benchmarks, maybe another LLM, analyzing that output to ask, hey, is this actually commensurate with is it commensurate with our brand, our brand style? B, is it all accurate? Blah, 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 blah. And then I take it, your point is, every quarter, every month, every week, whatever it is, you're like, hey, you know what? Let's put that thing in again. Let's put that same prompt in again. See if it gives different outputs. It's probably going to be slightly different outputs since it's non-deterministic, right? So you're going to run that brand analysis on the outputs again, and you might be like, oh, interesting. The accuracy increased. It's actually summarizing our product better than it was before, but it's not quite as on brand as it was before. So there's something that's going on the OpenAI side of things, such that we're having more difficulty getting on brand content.
Yeah, exactly. And I would just go a step further and not even like someone has to think, let's rerun that again. Just automate it. Every week it runs, spits out the number in the dashboard. And then the final thing I would say that I'm seeing companies adopt as a technique for effectively monitoring LLM or GenAI system performance is, it's very simple and it's subjective, but it is the human scoring of the response feedback loop, right? Which is, I don't know if you've been through TSA, and some airports have those, the sort of happy face and sad face, or the green thumbs up or red thumbs down. And just giving the end consumer, because a lot of consumers of these systems are humans, they're not automated processes. And you give the end user the easy feedback mechanism of, was this a good response or not? And then again, you can track the rate of response grading over time. And so over time, if responses have been getting 75% positive, and now all of a sudden they've trended down to 50% positive, something is not working as well in your system. The hard part then is backtracking, debugging that, right? Is that because the underlying LLM has changed, or because you're giving it different data in your RAG use case, or because your users have started using the system in a way that it wasn't intended for? So anyway, that gets hard.
So if I have this right, the answer is something like, all right, look, here's some places where technology comes into play, where there are tools that are useful for making sure AI doesn't go sideways. One isn't just the kind of thing that we're talking about at the top of this podcast, which was just managing the governance, managing process and procedures, and making sure that everyone's doing their shit in the right way. They're communicating to each other, blah, 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 blah. That doesn't have to be particularly fancy, right? That's not an AI. That's unlikely to be, I would think, a kind of AI tool to help you. That's just a kind of piece of software or something along those lines.
A lot of business domains have systems of record,
Yeah.
which are ways to implement process
Yeah.
and ensure auditability and traceability of the inputs that were created.
Yeah.
And model governance and AI system governance is an area where a system of record process orchestrator can be a big help.
Yeah. And then I take it that there's a second place where things get interesting from a sort of tech solution-y perspective, two sides of the same coin or something like that. There's the inputs and the outputs. So we're going to input some information into the generative AI or insert a prompt. And there's interestingly at least two kinds of things. One kind of thing that gets done there is that certain kind of information gets filtered out. So you try to say, I try to put in like, hey, if given that my name is Reed Blackman, my birthday is on this day and my social security number is this, what do you think is, I don't know, whatever. Maybe I'm like into horoscopes or something. And I ask it like, where's Jupiter going to be in a year? Whatever. When I turn 50, whatever. But you could have a kind of tech filter that says, oh, that's a social security number and data point. Like, I'm blocking that out. It's not going to get sent to, let's say it's an open, let's say it's not, you don't have the LLM in-house. You're using the services of a Google or an Anthropic or a OpenAI, Microsoft. It just doesn't get sent. Like, it just doesn't get to leave the walls of the organization. There's just a block. That's no good.
Mhm.
That's one kind of thing that a tech tool can do, is filtering out or blocking certain kinds of prompts. And then on the output side of things, you can scan it for, among other things, let's say tone or style or inappropriateness, toxicity, just unsafe output. Oh, this is instructions about how to build a bomb. That's the other thing that you can scan, you can do for the inputs as well. If someone says, how do I make a bomb? That's another kind of thing that you're going to block. It's not private information, but it's whatever, harmful content, whatever one wants to call it. So you've got this sort of a tech solution analyzing the inputs and analyzing the outputs. And then you've got this other bucket, which is using technology to test the foundation models themselves. Did I miss anything?
Yeah. The variation of the first one was more the human subjective as opposed to the
we can
more precise evaluation.
We can track the extent to which people are happy. Obviously, we can track the extent to which people are using it, and you can also track the extent to which they're generally happy or unhappy with the outputs. I know it gets more fine grained than that, but
I would say like the difference between that and maybe say a toxicity screen is the toxicity is a question you can answer on an individual output. Did this output violate our policy or not?
Yeah.
The subjective human scoring is a way to gauge a trend over time, which can be illuminating for different reasons, right? It tells you that something is no longer working as expected or as it was, and that change is important.
Yeah. Okay, you had a question for me.
I was going to ask for some of your sort of predictions about where this is all going to go over the next few years.
Yeah, that's okay. So where's it going to go? First of all, I should say, I think everyone's pretty bad at predictions. That's why we have AI. I don't know. Every year that I've been doing this, I started my own consultancy 6.5 years ago, something like that. Mid 2018, I want to say, maybe late 2018. And I've only seen increases year over year of companies, large Fortune 500 companies, taking this stuff seriously, trying to figure out what to do, implementing, designing AI governance programs or AI risk programs or whatever the heck you want to call it. And I've only seen it increase year over year. That said, my sense is that even though we're seeing an increase, it's still hopefully it's early days, right? Because I still think that the vast majority of companies out there are not doing really anything. I think that data scientists are generally a bit too overconfident in their ability to do it by themselves. And I still think that a lot of people, this is beginning to change. I think a lot of non-technologists are scared of the topic because it's easy to be intimidated by the language that data scientists and engineers speak and to think, let's say I'm a compliance person or I'm an HR person or I'm a lawyer or I'm in marketing or I'm just a non-technology member of the executive of the C-suite. I'm a non-technology board member, right? Like I'm a 70-year-old non-technologist on the board, which is probably most board members right now who didn't grow up with the internet, let alone, I don't think they feel comfortable. And so I think one problem that we have now with, I'm not predicting, next year everyone and their mother's going to be doing AI governance, is because I think people are unjustifiably intimidated because they don't think that they're going to be able to really address it because they don't have the confidence or the facility with the language of AI, machine learning, blah, 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 blah. So I do think we'll see an increase. I just don't think that it's going to be the vast majority of companies. So part of me wonders, Are we going to see the slip ups from the companies that we all know, or are we going to see more slip ups from the companies who are, I don't know, who are less aggressive in trying to figure this out?
Yeah. And to connect that back to my comment earlier about the two worlds of like regulated industries and non-regulated industries, or like companies have been thinking about model governance for decades for other reasons. I think this is what you're saying. My prediction for what it's worth is there'll be more slip ups from the companies that have not already had to build infrastructure to think about model governance.
Yeah.
Like the Air Canada chatbot? Was that the company?
Yeah, so stupid. Although that was the case where make a customer's facing chatbot, the customer says, "Hey, what's your bereavement fair policy?" They tell the person X. He says, "Great." Turns out it's not X. He looks for reimbursement. And then Canadair says, that's not our policy. The AI got it wrong. That's the AI's fault. He sues. Canadair loses.
Yeah, so a minor financial loss. But as using that as an example,
big reputation loss.
We work with a bunch of financial services customers, and I can tell you, like, all of them have told me, "Oh yeah, there's no way we're putting a GenAI chatbot in front of our customers."
Yeah.
Maybe for very low stakes technical support things, but not for any question where money is involved.
Yes.
Culturally, that's obvious to a finance company in a way that it wasn't to an airline.
Okay, I'll make a more robust prediction. There's going to be, I don't know if it's going to be one big thing or a series of medium things where people are like, oh shit, we actually got to have to get our act together on the AI governance front. So will it be like Cambridge Analytica level? Maybe not. Probably not. I think it'll be more like Canada Air style stuff, but maybe a little bit bigger. And I think there's probably going to be a steady enough drip that's it's going to tilt the balance to most companies doing AI governance as opposed to the minority of them.
Well, here's a darker hypothetical future. I'm curious your take on this. Do you think that's going to lead to, there's a version that leads to companies internally getting their act together like you're describing.
Yeah.
There's, I think, a darker version where it leads to more government regulation that actually really slows innovation. By analogy, it'd be like how like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl really slowed down or crippled the potential for nuclear power.
Right.
Which I think on balance was like a deep loss for humanity.
3 Mile
and in large
Island,
ways, like
open back up.
Yeah, we lost how many decades?
I
think like in retrospect, an over rotation in response to a admittedly very bad and tragic accident.
Sure. But
if you look at the balance, like impact the nuclear power could have prevented for climate change, we would have weighed it differently.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm curious, what do you think is going to happen with the government and what kind of role that's going to lead to?
Maybe ask me after Tuesday, but I guess
the EU still got their own thing going.
I was going to say Europe, 100%. They're already doing that. They're already starting to stymie innovation over there by virtue of what they were doing. Even if the general approach or the idea was a good idea, I'm less convinced that the execution was great. But I don't know. The US, I don't think I see that happening. I guess I'd want to know, other than that example that you just gave, the nuclear example, are there cases where the US just created laws and regulations that really stymied innovation? Is there some big sort of once in a generation technology where they just stopped it and it became not the technology that it would have been? I'm not.
I don't know. I'm not an ethical historian.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not. We need like a historian on regulations, and I'm definitely not one of them. But even if the thing is, we didn't see any regulations after Cambridge Analytica, and that was justified or not. The outrage was massive, and it led to nothing, legally speaking. So I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen.
You mentioned the EU versus US different perspective. It's interesting. From the early forays into both geographies attempted regulation, I've had the opposite reaction so far. Like I think the EU AI Act is much more sensible and much less limiting of innovation because it's use case based. Whereas I think like the executive order the US put out, which has all these limits on like how much GPU capacity you can use, that to me feels like a misguided innovation limiting approach. Because like who cares how many
it's so stupid
petaflops or whatever you're using? It really comes down to what's the use case and what process went into ensuring safety and control of how it's going to be used. So I was surprised. I found the EU approach more sensible and less innovation restrictive than the US's approach. But we'll see. I think they'll straighten it out.
Yeah, the US thing is totally unenforceable at the moment anyway. So that's one reason why I'm less worked up about. That's another reason why I think the US is not really going to do anything. Like sure they'll put out frameworks and strongly worded statements that don't really amount to anything. And the EUA Act, I'm fine with the high risk category and look at things with high risk and they require a certain kind of due diligence. I think that's totally fine. I don't think that it unnecessarily stymies innovation. It might slow it down a little bit. I don't see that as necessarily bad. Move fast and break things doesn't seem great. If you're government, you're in the business of making sure that shit doesn't break. That's really important. So if that requires companies to slow down a little bit and that slows innovation to keep people safe, I don't see that as a terrible thing. I think some of the things that they put in the sort of prohibited category seem odd or seem unnecessary, like no sentiment analysis. Or you can't read sentiments on faces or something like that. It seems like that seems surely to your point, the use case matters. There are going to be use cases where that's ought to be regulated against. And there's going to be use cases where that seems totally appropriate. So it seemed to me a little bit coarse-grained the way they talked about the prohibited use cases. But no, the other stuff I'm generally cool with. Cool, man. This was fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
That was Reed Blackman and Nick Elprin. If you've enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe to both the Data Science Leaders podcast and the Ethical Machines podcast. Until next time.